before, I was just saying before, a lot of the audience members might have joined. This is the first time I've spoken about my PhD, which is focusing on people smuggling, and I'm kind of in the midst of it, and so therefore the scrambledness of this talk may reflect the scrambled thoughts of my PhD. So I'm kind of putting together a lot of the ideas at the moment. Gabby, just remind me, how long did you want me to speak for, just so I can...
Well, the whole session is an hour, so I'm not expecting you to talk for that long. So, you know, maybe half an hour and then questions, but I suspect there'll be lots of questions. So.
Yeah, so I'll see what I can get through, and then perhaps it'll cover a lot of what I'm doing, but perhaps not. This is a bit untested for me. So originally the purpose of my my research was to investigate this idea of the justification for border control, as which we've heard from Labor and Liberal governments saying that people smugglers are evil, that it's scum of the earth. We have to control the borders to stop people smugglers profiteering from, you know, the desperation of refugees, and therefore then we have to do all these things like offshore detention centres, and turn back the boats and things like that. And so I wanted to investigate that notion of, you know, the inherent evil of people smugglers, and what were the practices on our borders, and how did that fit into a global context. And the original plan was to look at people smuggling operations for the Rohingya people, looking at their route from Myanmar to either Bangladesh or through Southeast Asia to Malaysia and then on to Australia. And I was set to embark upon that research about 3 weeks before the COVID pandemic spread around the world. And so, like many of you, my plans were scuppered. And so I had to do a rethink and a shift, and conduct that research while kind of under lockdowns and things, which has been possible. It's not ideal, but it has been possible. But it has forced me to focus much more on the experience within Australia of people who've either been engaged in smuggling or been affected by Australian policies around people smuggling. So to give you the kind of background and the chapters that I've been writing most recently, I essentially wanted to look at the justification for border control leading up to the present day. And I took that back to Vietnam, but also earlier, to kind of understand our obsession or our, the Australian kind of need for border control. And so that, I mean, when you look at the stuff that I found out interestingly through the Vietnam process was, you know, we look upon it with these, maybe through rosier eyes than we should have. And there were a lot of great things done by Malcolm Fraser to bring Vietnamese people over, but the general rhetoric and language in the media and in politics at that time was about as, you know, it's similar and reflective of what's happening in the last decade or two. You know, dehumanizing language, suggesting that people were going to the dirty anti-boat rhetoric that we'll come to see in future years. And actually it was Gough Whitlam who was responsible for first pushing the kind of Q jumper, good refugee, bad refugee arguments, which was surprising to me. I haven't, you know, this is all quite new to me, this stuff, because it was some time before I was born. And then through each wave of boat arrivals, we've seen similar types of kind of public and media and political hysteria that rise up. So the next phase was in the 80s, and there was similar kind of language, and Bob Hawke is quoted with some pretty awful stuff of trying to say our compassion shouldn't be monopolized, etc., by people coming by boat. Again, arguments that would be repeated by John Howard a decade later. And it was under, in the Bob Hawke era in the 90s, that was the first time boat arrivals were used to change legislation to enact a type of border control measure, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. But that was the introduction of detention, and then that later became mandatory detention for an extended period. It was initially restricted to 48 hours, and then time constraints were dropped in 1994. And so now, 27 years later, the average time held in detention is 627 days, the highest it's ever been. So that, you could, Paul Keating comes and says that Howard, bastardized the intent of what they were trying to do, but that was essentially the foundation which led to serious other changes. And I'll get into the Howard era slightly after that, but I'll go into it now. So the Howard era is where it became, as we all know, particularly vitriolic and awful kind of language towards people arriving by boat, and it was where that issue got weaponized in a federal election and used to change huge amounts of border control policy, essentially leading to the Pacific Solution, boat turnbacks, temporary protection visas. And even, in Howard, there were the first kind of targets, as far as I can see so far from my research, towards people smuggling, but it was not the main way to try and discuss or to try and manipulate border rhetoric and ideas around border control. Where it really changed and where the political debate switched towards having people smugglers as the people that were demonized was actually under Kevin Rudd. And so in that election, the 2007 election, when Labor won, they didn't, you couldn't say they necessarily won on fair border control or more just border control policies, but they did have a base that would not accept the demonization of people seeking asylum as a justification for border control. And so they needed, while that was true, they also still wanted a strict border control policy, and they needed to justify it in some way. And when the boats started turning up again, they had to find a different kind of scapegoat, and that scapegoat became the people smugglers. And that's not to suggest that at this stage we'll get into the exploring what is a people smuggler and who they are, but and whether looking at the morality of it all, whether they're good or evil. But that was the intent, was to say we need to shift away from demonizing refugees and asylum seekers, and we need to shift it to someone we can blame. And I've been looking at these theories of scapegoating, where it's essentially saying to scapegoat someone, you need to have this understanding that they are completely guilty, and all of the blame can be laid upon this person. And the minute doubt and nuance comes into that idea of what the people smuggler is, then that challenges the idea of, can we scapegoat them and justify all of the policies that we have and the treatment we have of people of seeking asylum if the people smuggler isn't as evil as they suggest. And you'll note from all the language, it's really black and white. People smugglers are the worst thing that could ever happen. So that kind of sets that up as an idea of why we got to that point. But I even looked further back to like the essentially colonization, and the reason why we federated, among many, one of the major reasons why we federated was essentially trying to get a national immigration policy that could restrict Chinese migration. And before that, some of the first policies made by the colonies, such as Victoria in 1855, was the Act to make provision for certain immigrants, again designed to prevent Chinese immigrants from entering the country. And so, yeah, one of the first pieces of legislation we passed as a federated colony, or as a federation, was the the Immigration Restriction Act, which was eventually turned into the White Australia Policy, which lasted until 1973. So we have a long history of racializing our borders and premising those borders on whiteness. And so even when the Jewish refugees were fleeing from Europe in World War II, they were deemed not white enough for Australian society, and that they wouldn't be able to immigrate and settle and assimilate. You know, and we would laugh at that kind of suggestion now, but that was the kind of the background to the anti-boats policy. And so when the first boats arrived from Vietnam, I think it was in 1976, the White Australia policy had only ended a few years earlier. And so we talk about, you know, that historically the migration of human groups increases prejudice and discrimination in the country. But in Australia, there's this particular focus on boats. You know, as you all know, when planes arrive with people seeking asylum, we don't have that same type of anxiety and insecurity around it. And so there's a lot of scholars that look at these ideas of invasion anxiety, and particularly linked to boats, which makes you kind of feel like we have this, and it's actually an Aboriginal scholar, has this idea that Australia doesn't want to, or is scared of having the same type of treatment they inflicted upon the Aboriginal people happen to them, or happen to us. And so that's one way of rationalizing or trying to explain away this invasion anxiety. But then there's also this underlying key theme to everything, this fear of uncontrolled migration. And whether that be, you know, justified or not, that seems to be this key theme that runs through all of our boat and border control policies, is this fear that, you know, suddenly millions of people are going to arrive on our doorstep and either invade us by conflict or invasion via migration. Yeah. So that sets up, as much as I can, the first section. Does anyone have any questions around that before I dive further in? I feel like that's kind of a lot of, you may already know a lot of that information, but hopefully it surprised some of you with some of it.
Yeah, just pop it in the chat line. I think there are a few questions.
There's 3 questions there in the chat. And the first from Philip Feinstein. How regarding the people smugglers, brackets heroes, who were taken into custody on arrival by Border Force and then arrested, are they still in custody? Where will we ever be able to return to their homes? Maybe that will come later.
Yeah.
Jane Tuza, who stole this country first?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that later. And grandmothers, why are plane arrivals treated so differently from those on boats?
Well, I guess that was the rationale I just gave, was this idea that for perhaps those reasons, given we have this deep anxiety around people arriving by boats, and maybe it's the image of it, maybe it's it can be politicized easier, and maybe just because 4 decades of boat arrivals have been politicized, perhaps that's why. And there is this strong image of people coming on boats that always gets brought in, where people arriving on planes doesn't have the same, doesn't provoke the same type of anxiety and fear. But I would also be able to answer that better if I had written that chapter yet, but that's one of my chapters to come. So perhaps next time we talk, I can answer that question better. So the next section of the boy, yeah. So that leads to, like, Kevin Rudd and Julie Gillard essentially trying to justify border control as this issue of people smugglers. And what ended up happening was, when the boats kept coming, that then meant that we kept having to have more strict and more harsh penalties, continue with this justification of people smugglers, and that led to some extreme policy changes, which I'll get into hopefully in time. For now, I'll just jump into this idea of what is a people smuggler, and this actually is a lot more complex than I first thought, and it was the easiest possible way to look at it is saying that the labeling of people smugglers as evil is clearly an oversimplification of a very complex global and historical phenomenon. And so as long as, and again, there's a lot of different definitions out there, and your perspective, your understanding of what a people smuggler is very much dependent on your perspective. And so you'll look at the Department of Home Affairs definitions or the international agreements, international conventions on law, and their understandings, and then the most broad and probably inclusive way of looking at it I came across was that as long as societies have tried to manage the movement of humans, people have sought ways to circumvent borders or bypass restrictions, and smugglers play an essential part in this process. And so people usually engage smugglers when legal migration opportunities aren't available, and that's often in order to escape violence, persecution, armed conflict, natural disasters, or poverty. And so most modern definitions identify people smugglers as individuals or groups who assist unauthorized entry into countries through irregular methods. Although, as some of you may be aware, there's often people smugglers operate within countries to assist people in and out of conflict zones or even restricted zones. So if you look at stories like, I don't know if anyone here has read Habib Rahman's book, First They Erased Our Names. It's a Rohingya account of life under the Myanmar military regime, and then his escape. They were restricted to zones in the country. So even to leave the kind of district that he lived in, he needed to bribe officials, get travel permits, etc., just to even get to the next village, district, etc. So for him to escape Myanmar, he had to go through numerous different types of people smugglers to even get to the border to get out of the country. And so then, to put it up front, in case anyone hasn't worked this out yet, there's a very clear and common distinction between smuggling and trafficking. Smuggling is considered a consensual arrangement. So although obviously in a lot of situations there is a power imbalance, but the idea is that you will volunteer to either pay or be assisted by a person to get you out of a situation, where trafficking involves force, coercion, or deception. And then trying to define a people smuggler gets really difficult when you look at the range of groups and individuals involved in the activity at various levels for a variety of reasons, operating at different degrees of organisation and sophistication. And so when you say, when you hear the government say these business models and these international criminal networks, those things do exist. International criminal networks who operate outside of smuggling and have various other methods have been involved in smuggling. So if you look at the Mexico-US border, you have the drug cartels who assist and are involved in smuggling across borders. But there's also a wide range of other types of smuggling. You have amateur smugglers, and they can operate on their own or operate a service for a large organisation. So that might be transporting people across borders, or hiring out a hotel or something like that. You have the international smuggling networks, and that's separate to the criminal networks that I'm talking about previously, like drug cartels. You have larger international smuggling networks that can operate across numerous countries. So an example of that might be, one of the stories we heard, one of the stories I've written about is when Jewish refugees were trying to get out of, firstly out of Europe after the First World War, trying to get to the US, but then a very similar thing occurred trying to get to Australia after the Second World War. There were restrictions placed on Jewish migration to America at that period and to Australia. And so a network of Jewish people assisted in forgery and all sorts of methods to get people into Australia and America from Europe. And that happened across multiple different countries. The American one was quite fascinating because they'd have Jewish people in places like Cuba and Havana, in Canada, in Mexico, and they'd be forging these documents and getting people from all parts of Europe. At that time, let me have a find of the actual city. There was a city in Europe that became famous among the, where is it? Yeah, in Berlin and Warsaw, smugglers would approach immigrants waiting in line at the consulate. This was after the First World War. They'd congregate in port cities in places like Havana and Cuba at the waterfront. They'd go to brothels and bars and all the different international hangouts and recruit people to get to the US or at that time. So those are some examples of international networks. And then there's also people in between who have these kind of medium style setups. So there's a vast range of different organizational structures which can act as people smuggling networks. And then within those networks, there are numerous roles and responsibilities that can be, filled by one person or by many. And that can include coordinators, recruiters, transporters, guides, enforcers, debt collectors, informers. Corrupt public officials could be considered people smugglers, people who work in border roles, air and maritime crew, money launderers. So all of these people operate within this hierarchy of these smuggling operations. And so when you say what is a people smuggler, that makes it then very difficult to ascertain. And this will become really relevant when we look at the way Australia targeted different people for their involvement in operations. And so, within that whole understanding of what a people smuggler is, they can be these huge criminal networks, and they can be, drug cartels. I remember being on that border in Mexico and having drug cartels shoot at people who they didn't want as part of their, their smuggling route through to the US. But then those people also saved a lot of lives. Those cartels. They were charging a lot of money, but they were the only ways to get people across into the US. But then they can also just be as banal as travel agents who organize a visa for someone. That is. And then depending on whether you had a positive experience with the people smuggler or a negative experience, you might think of them as a hero or as a as one of the worst people you've ever met. I'm just looking at time, and I'm already at 26 minutes in. I've got a lot more to talk about. I'm just wondering how much more time would I have to talk, do you think?
We'll go for another 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. I will skip through all the examples I have of the different types of smuggling that throughout history, but essentially there's a long history of smuggling. It's happened all over the world. It's in our ancient texts, it's in the Bible, it's in ancient Greek mythology with the elopement of Helen. It goes through various periods of conflicts and war. There's examples of humanitarian smuggling, such as the Underground Railroad in the US. People have paid for smugglers for a very long time. There's evidence of that when the Huguenots escaped France and got to England. And so this idea that they're inherently evil, to sum up an entire chapter in one sentence, is just, it's the practice itself is inherently evil. But
somebody not on mute. Could you mute, please?
Yeah, so the practice itself, it clearly isn't inherently evil, but the people who practice it and their different methods and the different ways they do it, that is where there is some kind of moral judgment. But as you will see with this current conflict in Afghanistan, and what I've written about here, is that the way the current system is set up, the global system, and the way that Western governments demand people to come through legal channels when there's clearly not enough avenues for legal channels, there is a demand and a need for people to engage smugglers, or whatever you want to call it, to escape conflict, to enter countries unauthorized, and to seek asylum. And interestingly, the so by international law and international conventions, people smuggling is criminalized, but only if it's done for profit. So there is a clause that says if it's done for humanitarian reasons, then it's not considered a crime. The Australian government doesn't abide by this. And in fact, when Kevin Rudd was enacting this idea that people smugglers were the reason for borders being insecure, they then added this idea to the National Security Act, saying that that people smuggling therefore was an issue of national security, and that then made it an issue for ASIO to investigate. And so now, when you have someone who is suspected of people smuggling, ASIO can become involved and can cancel a person's visa based on suspicion of people smuggling. You are not allowed to see the evidence for that, that suspicion. Their visa can be cancelled, and if they're a temporary visa holder, they are then placed into detention. And if they're in a position where they cannot be returned to their country, such as many of the people that I've been interviewing, people from Afghanistan, for instance, will not be able to be returned to the country. Refugees who have been found to be owing protection rights, who then have their visa cancelled and can't be deported, they end up in indefinite detention. So a number of the cases we've heard, or some of the cases I've heard, there was a young man who was accused of being involved in people smuggling. His visa was cancelled. He was placed in detention. That was in, I think, 2012. It's now or maybe it was even, 2012. It's now 2021. He's been there for 9 years. He's never seen the evidence for his case. Eventually, we got the freedom of expression, freedom of information request for his the ASIO documents, and within those documents, it said there was not enough evidence for a case against him, for a criminal case against him, but because this is separate to the, sitting outside of the criminal courts, that didn't matter. He was reasonable, or he was suspected of being involved in a people smuggling operation, and it eventually turned out that the suspicion was that he had referred a few names onto a smuggler who then got on a boat which crashed and people died. Currently he served 9 years of a sentence of an indefinite detention. The person who was considered the kingpin of this smuggling operation, he's quite a famous smuggler called Saeed Abbas. He has been in prison for 3 counts of people smuggling. He has served his time and has now been released from prison. He's now currently in detention in Australia, but he's been released from prison. Meanwhile, the person who referred a few names onto him remains in indefinite detention. That's the current state where we're at now, and where the PhD is going. What were the consequences of this idea that suddenly we had to target all people smugglers? And has the shift in targeting people smugglers, what has that done for our concepts of ethics, of justice? Is it okay to imprison a person having never faced a crime, having never faced a criminal court, based on very shallow evidence that we haven't even seen the evidence? We just know that was the allegation, which he denies, may I say. There was 2 people involved in that case, actually. This young man is one of them. His friend has a family, a wife and 3 or 4 kids. Apologies that I've forgotten that momentarily. He was allowed to travel to Pakistan, had his visa cancelled while he was in Pakistan, and he's not a citizen of Pakistan, he's a citizen of Afghanistan. And now he's stuck in Pakistan. He's obviously too afraid to go back to Afghanistan, and his family remain behind in Australia, again based on allegations. And we haven't seen the freedom of information document, or the ASIO documents relating to his case. But this is a case that, without any due process, without being able to go through the courts to challenge it, this man is now stuck in Pakistan. And so then we go back to this idea of like, what are people smugglers? Are they inherently evil? No. There's a whole lot of other moral arguments I would make, but because of the time, it makes it a bit challenging. But essentially, you know, when you read accounts of people coming to Australia by boat, there are a lot of horrific accounts of the way that the boats have been overloaded, the quality of the boats, and what has led to, you know, these awful people smuggling practices. But then there's also this level of this question of what kind of responsibility and autonomy do people have in electing to get on these boats, and where do we stand as a paternalistic kind of attitude to say that we must stop the boats to save their lives, but we're not actually going to go and save their lives, you know? So we'll stop the boats, but then what happened when they remained in Indonesia? We closed off resettlement rights in Indonesia. There's a whole lot of other moral arguments I would like to make, but I'm just conscious a bit of time and not going over.
You can go over it if you've got time, you know. But there's some questions there, Barbara.
Yeah, Ringa asks, are there smugglers who come out by boat as people smugglers, but also as refugees?
Yeah, great question. This will probably actually be a lot easier for me at the moment because all my my information is in my head but not written down, so I haven't had a chance to order it all and write a speech. So yes, this is a really common. This is another interesting part of the you know, are people smugglers evil and who are actually people smuggling from Indonesia to Australia. There are a number of, and it's a very common occurrence for people to who become stranded in Indonesia to then operate as people smugglers. So there's a very famous case of Ali Al-Janabi, the smuggler, written by Robin de Crepney.
Yeah.
This is just one of many examples because essentially you get to the other end of the other side of the world and you start to run out of money and you're not necessarily allowed to work legally. You might not have the language skills in a country like Indonesia. And what do you know? You know, people coming across, you know how to, you understand the system because you've been trying to get on a boat this whole time. And in those cases, there's examples of people saying they were doing it for humanitarian reasons, like Ali Al-Janabi. There's another case of a guy called Dawood Amiri who wrote Confessions of a People Smuggler. He's another case of saying, yes, I was a refugee who was stranded, ran out of money, and this is how I tried to fund my way across. But he also says he was trying to save lives. But then you've also got cases like Said Abbas, who became quite well known for his practices. He was the person I mentioned where the boat drowned. A lot of people died when the boat crashed. So that's a really common way, and what often happens is people work within their ethnic groups to help people come across. And so you'll have people of varying ethnicities and nationalities operating in those spaces. But often it will involve, you know, the smuggling operation will involve various other people, and you'll have, you know, Indonesian hoteliers or bus drivers or fishing boat captains. So it's not always just that one person, you know, there'll always be a group. On top of that, I hope I haven't, the idea of this wasn't to essentially say people smugglers are wonderful, because there's all sorts of examples of really horrible practices. But as an example to underpin, for instance, this idea that they put people on boats that aren't fit, aren't seaworthy. There's this wonderful academic called Anshe Nisbach who has been looking into this space for, I think, close to 2 decades. And she wrote an incredibly interesting piece where once the Australian government started sinking boats when they got to into Indonesian waters or whatever, and once the boats, then people started saying, okay, well, we shouldn't be using the really expensive boats. We should be using, you know, cheaper boats, then we don't lose as much money. Maybe other questions.
Okay. Have you had any contact yourself with people smugglers as part of your research?
Yeah, I've had come into contact with people who have acted as people smugglers and people who've been accused of acting as people smugglers. Yes.
There's I think more of a comment here. The ABF Border Force seem to act like kidnappers and smugglers at times. Or
yeah, it's an
you all
interesting.
agree with that?
No,
Yeah.
it's an interesting point, that one, because there's been a lot of evidence of not just the ABF, but ASIO operations of trying to. This is something I'm looking into at the moment as well. So these aren't concrete ideas, but it's just the area of research that I'm in. But this idea of boat turnbacks it's worse than smuggling. It's trafficking, because you're forcing someone back into this situation where they might not want to be. But beyond that, there's also examples of physical violence against people, of trying to sabotage boats so they can't make it to Australian waters or international waters. So there's a long story to that as well, which I'm currently investigating.
Right. Philip, why do people in Australia believe that Labor has better policies since they were both involved in indefinite detention? I don't know if you can answer that.
I think that would be, I'm sure people in the Liberal Party probably would say not, but it's funny, isn't it? Because for the majority of for the last 5 decades, the Australian Labor Party have been as bad, if not worse, than the Liberal Party. And it was really only, for a long time, there was always some kind of opposition to weaponizing the race card and the boat, the anti-boat rhetoric at some point. So when Gough Whitlam was trying it, Malcolm Fraser pushed back. When Howard tried it in the 80s, the Liberal Party kind of knocked him down. But when Howard did it in the 90s and the early 2000s, he was able to do it so successfully because Kim Beazley offered little to no opposition, and in fact went along with that and didn't push back against it and didn't call them out. The Labor Party has a horrible history on this front.
Okay. Philip would like to know, all the people who are who are in Australia but who've left families behind in Indonesia, of any organisation that's helping them or supporting them in Indonesia?
People in Indonesia. So there are some great schools which you may or may not be aware of, Phil, who do some good work. The names of which I have to find, but I think the Staging Post was one of the documentaries about it, and I think there's a Chisarua Learning Centre, I think, is one.
Yeah. Chisarua Refugee Learning Centre, Mark.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll chuck that in the chat. Apart from that, from memory, because I was there maybe 5 or 6 years ago, writing some stories about it. I think JRS operate pretty well there. That's from memory, but definitely the Chisarua Refugee. And there's a friend of mine runs a school there as well. I'd have to find the name of it. I'll see if I can find. I have a friend who's running a school. Hers is in Malaysia, so I'll find that as well.
Right.
The learning centres in the schools are pretty good.
Okay, Mark. Are there any people smugglers in detention as a result of the amendments to the Migration Act?
Yeah, so that's what I was talking about earlier. You might have put that in after that. So there's people that I've been working with who, so not only does they fall under the Migration Act, there's this next clause, and I'll have to go back through my notes on this idea of it's essentially when the national security issue meant that ASIO would then investigate people. But then there was also this idea of the grounds for character assessment. And so that's the part where if you have a reasonable suspicion that someone's committed a crime, then you can cancel their visa under character grounds. And so you've got this double whammy of people being suspected of being involved in people smuggling operations. And then if they, let's say that the people smuggling operations have since passed, or it was, for example, there's one guy who didn't operate within the region and assisted people to get out in a different scenario. They've now said, oh, well, because we suspect that you've been involved in a crime, we'll never give it to you because you have now don't pass this character assessment. So it's a bit of a double whammy. Yeah.
Right.
I'm publishing an article in this the Berlin anthology of refugees, published by the Berlin Writers Festival, and that has a strong article on all those issues. I'll see if I can find it and send it to you guys.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Right. Okay, Jane asks, do you think that indefinite detention has become a bit of a government corporate racket with so many large organisations like Serco and other contractors making millions out of it?
Yeah, so this is another good point, and this is something I'm writing a book at the same time as writing this PhD with a human rights lawyer who frees people from long-term immigration detention. But one of the ideas we're exploring is this similar to what America has. It's instead of the prison industrial prison complex, we have the immigration detention center complex, where you have multi-million-dollar contracts, very opaque systems of governance, and huge amount of money going into these private companies to run these centres, which seems to be pretty corrupt. So it's something we're looking into, and hopefully we'll have more on that soon, but that could be a year or two away still.
Yeah. Okay. Ali, who was the focus of the book, The People Smugglers, do you know what his current situation is?
Yeah, so he's got a pretty dire situation at the moment. The Australian government essentially never really given him a permanent visa, so he's been here for near on, I don't even know when he actually got here, but it'd be close to 15 years or more or so. And he has never really been given a permanent visa. And one of the cases I looked at in this research is, we have a guy who, because he's an Australian citizen, he was involved in this. He was involved in smuggling. He was put in prison and has served his 10-year sentence. But because he was an Australian citizen, they had to try him in a criminal court. And he went to prison and served his time. But if you're a temporary resident on a temporary visa, they can cancel your visa based on this suspicion, and then you never have to face a criminal court. And that's where you've got this for people on temporary protection visas and people seeking asylum. You have this idea, which has been happening since probably about Howard, definitely since Howard, and particularly Philip Ruddock, this idea of trying to move the immigration system outside of the courts and punish people outside of the judicial system, and that's why they're trying to bring in these administrative detention punishments for people who've been suspected of being involved in people smuggling.
There is a question here from Diane. It would be useful if some of the references you've made reference to were written. Is there somewhere that people can go to sort of check up on? Maybe the answer to that is, if your PhD, another question from Tim, will your PhD thesis be published or available following publication?
Yes, yes to both. I hope so. At the moment, I'm just kind of focusing on trying to write the PhD. So hopefully, once that's up and published, I can send it around and make it easily available, I hope.
That'd be great. Now, I think if I've missed your question, please put it in again. I've been trying to write them down and keep track. Jane just made a comment. If only more voters would carry out character assessments before they vote, that would be good. So I don't know if there are any more questions or if I've missed anybody.
Okay. in that case, I'll find this little bit of yeah. So I'll just read this. This is from my the piece I was writing about these two men who were accused of people smuggling and then refused visas and detained or cancelled and left in Pakistan. So the Rudd government's amendment of the term security in the ASIO Act to include the integrity of Australia's borders elevated people smugglers to a similar level of scrutiny as terrorists. Suddenly, people like Akbar and Ali with threats to national security rather than suspects of crime, and their right to a fair process was sacrificed. Keep in mind that when this was happening, when they were supposedly accused of committing the crimes, Indonesia, it wasn't even a crime in Indonesia at that point. So the involvement of the intelligence community in investigating people smugglers was clearly not enough power for subsequent federal governments. The Migration Amendment Bill was passed in 2014, which lowered the threshold of evidence required to refuse to grant or to cancel a visa on character grounds. Yeah. And so, here we go. With the government having, so ASIO assessments are forward-looking and can only judge whether a person continues to be a national security threat. So fewer boat arrivals meant less risk of alleged smugglers reoffending and therefore reduce the utility of the ASIO Act for the government. So that's when they introduced the Migration Amendment Bill, broadened the government's power to punish suspected smugglers. And the amendments meant that a person could fail the character test if the minister reasonably suspects that the person has been or is involved in people smuggling. So yeah, that clarifies the point I was trying to make before, which was a bit muddled because again, this is all in my head, but hard to put down. So one of the ASIO assessment essentially can only say if you continue to be a threat to national security. So I have one person who has, done the act of people smuggling, but is no longer going to be involved and does not want to, and is not a threat to national security no longer. But because he was involved previously, he still fails that character assessment and is currently sitting in indefinite detention. Again, without having ever faced a criminal charge.
Dana's made a comment here. Good on you for delving into this dark stuff that's so damaging to our democratic structures. And are you aware of any 501? Whoops, we lost that one. 501. I was just writing it out. 501 detainees transferred from Villawood to Yonga Hill last night. People smugglers amongst them.
Yeah, I mean, there may be. I haven't messaged the people I'm talking to because I've been so caught up in the Afghanistan stuff at the moment. So there may very well be. There's so much more we could talk about. I was also just conscious of leaving enough time to talk about Afghanistan if anyone wanted to. But another point of discussion that I'm looking into is this idea that for the majority of the time that we were prosecuting people smugglers, most of the people we were prosecuting were the boat captains from Indonesia, and there's some cases of people being who were underage and kept in, I don't know if it was immigration detention or I think it might have been in prisons. I'm still reading up on this case. And they were kept underage in prisons, and that was our punishment for these people smugglers. So there's all sorts of ways we've bent the rules and the laws in order to fight this supposed scourge of smugglers. There's also other cases of people who were kept in prison without any evidence, and then it turned out when the evidence that came out and they couldn't be, they were found to be not guilty. They then had to withdraw them from prison, but by that time these guys had already been sexually assaulted and physically assaulted. There's numerous stories, but I wonder if there are any questions around Afghanistan just while we have the time.
Just going to say we've pretty much come to the end. The rest are just comments. So if you wanted to talk about Afghanistan for a minute, that would be.
Yeah, maybe 5-10 minutes at the most. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So how to do it? I guess everyone's seen the news, so there's no need to put too much context into it. I think the biggest disappointment from our kind of advocacy point is that while it was quicker than expected, the demise of the the national government and the capitulation of the army. This was kind of like an inevitable process, I think, that's been coming for quite a long time, and the Australian government's failure to act, at the very least, to evacuate and withdraw people who've been working with defence forces, been involved in civil society groups and international NGOs. There should have been some process already set up, and the current idea that would resettle 3,300 once the Taliban's already taken control, when so many other countries are offering more, is pretty pathetic, but it's not so surprising from the likes of Dutton and ScoMo. And just, a nice little segue into the people smuggler stuff. It's very interesting that straight away they've started fear-mongering about people smugglers and illegal immigrants when these people are not even close to even being able to get out of Afghanistan. And so you look at the current situation where you've got banks closed, you can't get money in, you've got the airports controlled by the Taliban, roads are controlled by the Taliban. How do people get out who are going to be targeted by the Taliban, if not for people smugglers? And yeah, there are some horrendous examples of people smugglers that we can look at, but when you look at the majority of history and you look at the way people have escaped persecution, and I could talk for a long time about the different examples I've gathered, but the cases of people getting out of Nazi Germany, the base cases of people fleeing pogroms in Soviet Russia, the Russian Empire, even one of the more famous cases, which you might not have been aware, but the Dalai Lama escaping Tibet and Chinese rule, that was through people smugglers. There is no other option. There is no other way to get out. We're trying at the moment legal avenues, but what we've heard for all I goes from the guys who were involved in the peace community that I wrote about in the Kabul Peace House, they're in hiding, whether they're in Kabul or in other cities. Some went off into the mountains like their parents and grandparents did through the previous decades. Some of them still hiding in the mountains. And when you see the photos of those mountains, it's pretty rugged terrain. It's I can't imagine how that would be. Thankfully, one of the main characters in the book, Bojar, is now in Pakistan. I don't know how she got out, but she's there, which is fantastic news. But the Taliban are going door to door. They're scouring the internet to see if people have been active on social media. If those people are in Australia, like many of the people we would know, like Zaki Haidari, maybe his family is being targeted because of his advocacy over here. They're talking about women being married off to jihadists, forced into marriage. They have this idea that because the Taliban have said they will be lenient and there will be no revenge, everything that we've heard from people on the ground, including the guys I've been speaking to directly, suggests otherwise. They have been executing journalists, civil society activists. There's been beatings, all sorts of stuff on women. So it's a pretty dire situation, and it's very hard to see how people can escape at this point. And so we do need to push for as much as possible for extra placements, resettlement places in Australia. The Refugee Council of Australia put together a really impressive 7-point plan. But apart from that, donating and spreading the awareness and putting pressure on Scott Morrison to do more.
Well, I think we're very close to being out of time. Are there any last minute questions for Mark? Obviously, we could listen to you for hours, and we do hope that you'll come back, and with Zoom, that's so doable.
I think I'll have to, because I think I only talked about half of what I wanted to talk about.
Okay, you've just committed. Thank you.
Sorry it was so jumbled.
No, it wasn't. No,
not at all. Look, Mark, it's just great. I mean, it was good to hear about the I guess the history of how, past prime ministers have controlled the narrative around people smugglers and, and refugees generally. So, and to take us through the whole thing. I have to give everyone a plug for Mark's book, The Kabul Peace House, which I've read. It's just really is an amazing book. So, if you can get a hold of that, then I really recommend that you read it. And because Mark spent some time in Kabul, I don't know, did you go a few times, Mark?
Yeah, I went twice. I went in 2016 with the Edmund Rice Centre, and we have a fund set up to support Afghans in Afghanistan and in Australia if you guys are interested in looking for something. And we investigated deportations, which the Australian government was doing in 2016. And may I add, Europe is still doing, and even now with this current situation, there were 6 countries, I didn't read which countries they were, but in Europe who were saying they would continue deportations, even though the rest have halted, may I say, not ceased, halted. And Australia, thankfully, as far as I know, did stop deportations to Afghanistan. But we did that, and then we met this community of peace activists, and that's the people I've been communicating with the last.
Well, it would be interesting to see what's happening in a few weeks' time. And so the Peace House, is that disbanded? From what you're saying, people have fled, or?
I wouldn't say it's disbanded. Currently, I mean, I sent a message to one of the leaders the other day, just asking for help if they knew if there's a safe house for women that we could get some people to. And he said, you don't perform advocacy under the Taliban. So rather than say disbanded, I would say maybe they have halted operations, but the majority of people are in hiding, particularly the women, and seeking ways to get out. Thankfully, a number of the people I knew there's quite a few people I know. There's actually one guy I hadn't realised, but he's in Sydney, and some others made to Canada and various other places before this kind of conflict broke out. I mean, sorry, the most recent stuff.
Yeah, so they knew it was coming. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them knew it was coming, but people like Hojar, one of the main characters in the book, had always talked about, wanting to be there to work for peace within the country, even during the worst parts. But she had to run. She was petrified, and that's the hardest part, is hearing about just the people who are in this book, people like Muslim Yor, just sending messages like saying they're so afraid, and they really at grave risk of being targeted.
Right. Yeah. Awful.
Name of the book, Gabby? The name of your book, Mark?
I'll chuck it in the thread. It's The Kabul Peace House.
Thank you.
All right.
I just say, Mark, in the thread, there are many comments thanking you for your work and your initiative, and for this Zoom session and how informative it's been. One just quickly asking how we can help, and I think you covered that by donations and also by writing to ministers, Prime Minister, anybody you can.
If you want to help with the people smuggler stuff, there's a great, the book I'm working on is with Alison Batterson, and it's Human Rights for All. She does some really good work with people, essentially the people who are in long-term detention, and some of those people are people who have been involved or been accused of being involved in smuggling.
Yeah, I've put the link to donate out in our last newsletter, but you can easily find it, or if you need it, then you can contact me. Or there are Alison Batterson, Human Rights for All, and Alison actually talked to us on one occasion as well.
Yeah. Can I also say with that people smuggling stuff, is when you do get thrown into these detention centres and you're facing indefinite detention, you're then bunked with all these legal charges. And so Alison's wonderful because she does it for free, but she's one of a few who can do that. And like let's say if you were a wildly successful people smuggler, then maybe you could afford those fees. But if you're just being accused and you have no idea what the accusation is, how do you fight that, and how do you then pay for it? The case of Akbar, the guy who's in this that I've put in this article, when he got detained, he had a wife, and they just had no idea when they would see each other again. And it's been 8 years, and they ended up divorcing, separating, and it just tears families apart, these kind of policies. And so, yeah, that's also part of that industrial prison complex kind of idea of, the amount of money that the Australian government puts into defending these cases, phenomenal amounts of money.
Just on human rights for all, grandmothers do the City to Surf, and Wendy's here. Put your hand up, Wendy, there you are. I'm not quite sure how they're doing it this year. They did a virtual City to Surf run last year, and this year they're teaming up with Human Rights for All to fundraise for them. So, it'd be great if anyone wants to sponsor the Grandmother City to Surf team. So you can contact us about that. Okay, I think,
Debbie, it's Philip here. Can I say something?
Yeah, go on.
I just want to thank the grandmothers so much for being a part of Hope Behind the Wire. Without you guys, it wouldn't have been what it was. So I just want to say thank you. And Mark, good to see you too, mate.
Yeah.
Thank you, Philip. I haven't actually been headhunted yet, but I'm still waiting.
Finish the book and the PhD, then we can talk about that.
Best wishes with your book, Mark, and thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, Mark, I think we'll have to let you go, but I'll be in touch very soon. Don't forget, we need baby photos.
Yes, yeah. I sent one at the top. I don't know if you can all see it. It's the very top of the chat. There's one.
Oh, okay, I'll have a look. Thank you. And we'll definitely be in touch very soon to get you back, because there's so much more that you have to tell us, and what's happening in Afghanistan is unfolding all the time. And one of the things that really got to me, the women, I read somewhere that the women were getting worried that their clothes weren't long enough or their scarves weren't big enough. And I thought, what a way to live. So obviously it's going to be changing,
Yeah.
And so good luck with your move, and we'll be in touch soon. So thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Hey. Okay. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed.
Bye. Thank you
you.
very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
For organising it too.
And if anyone who hasn't joined Grandmothers,
Lovely to see you all.
yeah,
Yeah.
you can do that. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.